Hello and welcome to the Marcus Williams Training Academy Professional Misconduct Response Program. This is lesson 3 of the Pmrp. And lesson 3 is all about strategy, strategizing how to respond to allegations of misconduct. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do it, but we will dive a little deeper into how not to respond to misconduct and how strategy can actually get in the way of your response. So this is lesson 3 of the program. Lesson 1 was building your conduct policy. And lesson 2 was the reason why having a strong process is so important. And these lessons build on each other, but they also stand alone. So you are invited to go back and watch the previous 2 lessons, but you can also listen to our strategy lesson today, and it stands on its own. So my name is Marcus Williams, and I am the president of the Marcus Williams Training Academy, and I was actually a special agent with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and I served all over the world. So when I was serving in Italy, I was also working on my master's degree in criminal justice. I actually started the degree when I was a police officer at the Pentagon, and I started the fall semester of 2001. So a week or 2 weeks into my semester, 9/11 happened, everything was put on hold, and my degree path was stretched out a little bit. So I was working on my final few semesters while we were stationed in Italy, in Sicily. As a federal agency, we had a lot of policies and rules we had to abide by. Number one being the Constitution. So no matter where we were in the world, we were still led by and subject to the Constitution. But we also had our own internal agency rules and jurisdiction and policies. But being overseas and in different environments, we got a lot of different types of reports and different types of allegations that we had to fit within those rules, within those policies, within those investigative techniques. So I remember at one point we were having a problem where a lot of our sailors who lived out in the community, in the Italian community, there was a rash of car break-ins, and people were breaking their windshields and diving in and stealing whatever they could, whether it was their gym bag or their wallet or keys or whatever they left in their car. And it was becoming a very serious problem. It was happening all the time. So we went to the Italian authorities, the Carabinieri, and we came up with a joint operation because a lot of the victims of these crimes were Americans, but it was happening out in Italian jurisdiction. And we didn't know who the perpetrators were, whether they were American or Italian or something else, someone else from somewhere else. So we set up a sting operation where we had basically a bait car. It had a few things sitting around, nothing valuable, nothing super enticing, but just the small things that had been being stolen. And we sat on this car one night, and we were there probably an hour and a half, and the guys showed up, broke the windshield, dived into the car. So we all surrounded, we all dove in, and they turned out to be Italian. So as Americans, we stepped back, we allowed the Carabinieri to assert their jurisdiction. It became their case as the primary. So we had to adapt live as the situation was happening. If we had gone forward and they'd been Americans, we would have done it more jointly. And the rest of that night was very interesting because the Italians invited us to wait outside of their police station while they did their interrogation. They got the legal authority to go and search in the homes of the 2 perpetrators. There were 2 of them. And this was all late at night. And this is different than the way we would have done it in the U.S., but we weren't in the U.S. We were in Italy. And so we went along with them to help identify property that belonged to Americans as we conducted the search. And it was interesting to watch their process, their techniques in conducting the search, because it was a little bit different than the way we did things. But the important lesson coming out of that is that we could work together, we could cooperate, but most importantly, as agents who had very specific rules and policies and guidelines and laws governing our behavior, we were still able to adapt to a changing situation that was very different than the norm, very different than what you would normally see. So we didn't have to throw our policies out the window in order to respond to this crime. We could still use them and adapt accordingly. That's a little bit what we'll talk about today. Essentially, when you get an allegation, what path are you going to take? You've already developed your policy. You've already outlined your process in that policy. So you have a straight path that's already outlined. It's visible, it's clear of obstacles. You know exactly what to do. So that's the easy answer. We could end this presentation now. The strategy for responding to misconduct is to follow your policy. Well, if it were that easy, then we wouldn't see the mistakes that people make all of the time. Because people tend to try to respond to what the allegations were or what the circumstance instead of just referring to and depending on the policy. But if you have that policy and you have a designated decision maker who decides, who has the authority to decide, this is what we're going to do, this is how we proceed. I'm the person who decides if we're doing an investigation. I'm the person who assigns the investigator, someone with that authority to execute the policy. We talked about that in our earlier lesson, that it's so important to do that, to, in your policy, in writing, designate the official implementer of the policy, the decision maker. Now, of course, you want to keep your leadership informed. As we go through this lesson today, I don't want you to think that I'm ever saying to keep your leadership in the dark or keep them out of the loop. They need to know what's going on. They need to be able to respond. They need to be able to anticipate some of the consequences of what is happening. They need to know what is happening, but not be involved in what is happening. They need to allow the process to take its course. They've already agreed to the policy. They signed off on it publicly. We talked about that in creating your policy. That is why it's so important that your senior leader approves of publicly this policy, because they've already endorsed this path. They've already said this is the path that we're going to take. But instead of that straight and narrow, clear path, why do so often we take this moss-covered, scary path instead? So what happens if we receive a particularly egregious allegation? Maybe you're very used to seeing the same types of cases over and over. Depending on your industry or what you do or the type of product or service you provide, you may see the same type of allegation over and over. And then suddenly something new, something different comes in, and it seems much worse than the norm. Suddenly you start thinking, does my policy work for this? I've never done this before. This is totally new. This is totally different, and it's so much worse. What happens? Or what if that allegation involves a senior leader? So let's use that example, because we all know that an allegation involving a senior leader can garner a lot of media interest. So using the news, what if you have one of your senior leaders or one of your well-known public-facing figures in your organization is accused of telling, let's say, an intern. He told an intern that if she had sex with him, she would get a permanent position. And then when she said no, he forced himself on her and sexually assaulted her. That's the allegation. So you have someone who was an intern at the time alleging against your most senior person. And think for 2 seconds and you'll be able to come up with names of people in the news who were in very powerful positions who used those positions in order to sexually abuse people with less power. So that's a very common thing, and it hits the news. So what if that happens and you know it's going to hit the news? You know there's going to be media interest just because of the nature of the allegations, because of who's involved, and just because of the world that we live in. This is going to interest the public. That can cause a little bit of panic, a little bit of heartburn. What if that timing of the allegation directly impacts your business? You have an IPO scheduled, and suddenly this allegation comes out, and the investors start getting nervous. Or what if you are just about to close a big deal, and this allegation comes out, and now your buyer or your customer is nervous doing business with you. All of these things can happen because you're trying to run a business, you're trying to make money at the same time, and you can say, I don't have time for this. I don't have time to deal with these allegations. I need to focus on my business. What I'm saying is, how you deal with this allegation of misconduct is your business. It is going to impact your business. So you do need to deal with it. You do need to do it properly and do it correctly. What if in your industry, and this is very common in industries where the senior leaders, the CEOs, the presidents of different companies who are competing companies actually know each other and are friends with each other. They play golf together. They go out to dinner together. And they have these relationships. Well, what if it's that type of thing where one leader calls the other and says, hey, I hear there's an allegation against my nephew who works for you. Can you make this go away? Or what can you do to help me out? I'll throw some business your way. Trying to work your misconduct response into a business deal. And I'm not saying that what they're doing is evil or bad. This is the world they live in. They live in a world where if they need something, they make a deal, they negotiate. Well, in your misconduct response, that's not negotiable. But it can happen. It's happened to me. I've had people involved in my investigations go to someone they know with influence who would then talk to my leaders and try to influence the investigation. So you have all of these factors that are brewing, that are complicating this straight and narrow path that you should be taking.